On a cool morning in September 1987, the first pickup truck rolled slowly onto the gravel lane of a walnut orchard outside Yuba City, Sutter County, California. Its driver, Harold Benson, president of the local Growers Association, stepped out with two other farmers and stared across nearly 40 acres of mature English walnut trees. The orchard looked healthy enough, but something unusual covered the shaded ground beneath the branches. Instead of bare soil, weeds, or neatly mowed grass, hundreds of strange brown and cream-colored mushrooms pushed through carefully spread beds of hardwood chips. Harold frowned. One of the younger men beside him burst into laughter before saying a single word. News had traveled fast across the county that Margaret Collins, 72 years old and widowed for almost a decade, had decided to grow mushrooms beneath her walnut trees. Most people thought grief had finally clouded her judgment. Others believed she had simply become too stubborn to admit she was finished farming. They were all about to meet the woman who had no interest in proving anyone wrong. She only wanted to prove the land right. Margaret walked toward them without hurry, her faded denim work shirt tucked into worn canvas trousers, old leather boots carrying the reddish dust that had settled over the orchard after another dry California summer. Her hands were rough from 50 years of pruning limbs, repairing irrigation lines, and driving tractors that had long disappeared from dealership lots. Her gray hair rested beneath a weathered straw hat whose brim had been stitched twice by hand. Her eyes never searched for approval. They searched only for the condition of her trees. The youngest visitor laughed again. "Mushrooms?" he asked loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Under walnut trees? That's the craziest thing I've heard this season." Several men smiled. One actually clapped. Margaret simply nodded. "I've heard crazier," she replied softly. Nothing more. No argument. No anger. Just quiet certainty. Let me tell you about Margaret Collins. She and her late husband, Samuel, had purchased the orchard in April 1951 for $18,400, financing nearly every dollar to the local agricultural bank. Back then, the farm held just over 25 acres of producing walnut trees, planted shortly after World War II. Over the following 3 decades, they expanded the orchard carefully, never borrowing more than they could repay after harvest. They believed healthy soil earned more interest than any savings account. By 1980, the orchard had grown to nearly 40 acres, producing quality Chandler and Hartley walnuts that buyers across Northern California respected. When Samuel died unexpectedly from a heart attack in 1978, neighbors quietly assumed Margaret would sell within a year. She didn't. She continued pruning every winter. She irrigated every summer. She repaired every broken fence herself. And every autumn she harvested another crop. She rarely spoke at growers' meetings. She almost never complained. But she listened, always listened. Behind one of the equipment sheds rested the machine she trusted more than any new advertisement promising efficiency. A 1952 Farmall M, painted faded red beneath decades of California sun. Samuel had bought it used in 1961 from a farmer retiring near Chico for $1,650. The tractor produced around 38 drawbar horsepower, weighed nearly 5,500 pounds, and carried enough cast iron to remind anyone climbing aboard that it had been built for work instead of appearance. Every winter, Samuel changed his fluids before touching the house furnace. After his death, Margaret followed the same habit, without missing a single season. The Farmall wasn't simply transportation. It carried memories. Its steering wheel had been polished smooth by hands no longer living. Its engine still answered the same throttle movements Samuel had taught her decades before. Many farmers traded machines every 10 years. Margaret never saw the point. The orchard understood that tractor. And somehow, she believed the tractor understood the orchard. That afternoon, Harold walked beside her between 2 long rows of walnuts, occasionally glancing down at the strange beds spreading beneath nearly every tree. "You really expect these to grow?" he asked. "I expect the land to decide," Margaret answered. Harold looked unconvinced. "The university isn't teaching this." "No, the extension office hasn't recommended it. They haven't. You could lose a season." "I could." Her calmness frustrated him more than an argument would have. He stopped walking. "So why risk it?" Margaret rested one hand against the rough bark of an old walnut tree planted nearly 40 years earlier. Then she smiled. I noticed something nobody else bothered to notice. And before anyone understood what she meant, the first mushrooms began appearing across the orchard floor. Within 2 weeks, the scattered clusters became impossible to ignore. Small caps emerged first, then larger ones. Day after day, they spread beneath the filtered shade of the walnut canopy, pushing through the carefully layered hardwood mulch Margaret had hauled into the orchard during the previous winter. Every morning before sunrise, she walked each row carrying a small notebook instead of a harvest basket. She counted. She measured moisture. She wrote temperatures beside individual trees. It looked less like guesswork than a quiet experiment that had been planned for years. Across Sutter County, however, the story grew stranger every time someone repeated it. By the end of September, people were no longer saying an old widow had planted mushrooms beneath walnut trees. Now, they claimed she was trying to replace walnuts altogether. Others insisted the mushrooms would poison the roots. One man even swore the orchard would be dead before Christmas. Rumors often travel faster than tractors. This one certainly did. Let me tell you about walnut trees. Most people know they produce one of America's most valuable nut crops. Fewer people know they create deep shade, moderate soil temperatures, and drop thousands of leaves and twigs that slowly return organic matter to the ground. Many growers spend decades clearing every leaf from beneath their orchards because clean rows look professional. Margaret looked at those same leaves and saw something different. She saw a forest floor, and forests had been growing mushrooms long before people ever planted orchards. That thought stayed with her for nearly 5 years. The idea first came during the rainy winter of 1982, when she noticed wild mushrooms appearing near an old pile of walnut pruning limbs behind the equipment shed. Instead of throwing them away as weeds, she borrowed field guides from the Sutter County Library, read agricultural journals from the University of California, and spoke quietly with 2 mushroom growers several counties away who specialized in hardwood-loving varieties. Neither one laughed. Both simply told her the same thing. If you can control moisture, you might have something. From that day forward, she began experimenting on a patch no larger than the garden. Every failure taught her something. Every success stayed in her notebook. 5 years later, the experiment covered almost the entire orchard. Then came the annual growers' meeting at the Yuba City Grange Hall. Nearly 60 farmers filled folding chairs, while coffee brewed in large steel urns near the entrance. Margaret rarely attended. This year, she did. The discussion centered on irrigation costs, walnut prices, and another dry season that had everyone worried. Near the end of the meeting, someone mentioned her orchard. A younger grower named Rick Dalton, 38 years old and recently recognized for expanding his family's operation with modern equipment, couldn't resist. So, he said loudly, when do we start planting vegetables under our walnut trees too? The room chuckled. Rick continued, maybe tomatoes next year. More laughter. Then he added, or maybe mushrooms are what happens when you've been farming too long. The room erupted. Men slapped tables. Coffee spilled. Someone whistled. Harold Benson lowered his eyes, realizing the joke had gone too far. Everyone looked toward Margaret. She remained seated, hands folded, expression unchanged. When the laughter finally faded, she stood slowly. I hope every one of you has a better harvest than last year, she said. Nothing more. She picked up her hat, walked out the door, and never looked back. The silence she left behind lasted much longer than the laughter ever had. That evening she returned home before sunset, climbed onto the old 1952 Farmel M, and drove slowly between the rows while checking irrigation valves. The steady rhythm of the 4-cylinder engine echoed across the orchard exactly as it had when Samuel was alive. She shut the tractor down beside the mushroom beds and knelt in the soil. The newest clusters looked healthier than anything she had seen all season. She smiled to herself, not because the county had laughed, because the land hadn't. Have you ever owned something everyone else called worthless? Or believed in an idea so strongly that you stopped trying to convince people and simply kept working? Margaret understood that feeling better than most. She also understood something the county had not yet discovered. The mushrooms growing beneath those walnut trees were only the beginning. By the second week of October, buyers from outside Sutter County began making phone calls, and one of them was willing to pay a price that would leave every man in that Grange hall wishing he had asked questions instead of laughing. The first call came on October 11th, 1987. Margaret had just finished greasing the front axle of the old 1952 Farm Lamb when the telephone inside the farmhouse rang. She wiped her hands on a faded shop towel before answering. Margaret Collins speaking. The voice on the other end introduced himself as Daniel Foster, a produce buyer from Sacramento. "I've heard you've been growing specialty mushrooms beneath walnut trees." "I have. I'd like to see them." Margaret looked through the kitchen window toward the orchard. "They'll be waiting." 2 days later, Daniel arrived with refrigerated crates in the back of a white box truck. He expected a small experimental patch. Instead, he found row after row of healthy mushroom beds stretching beneath mature walnut trees, whose broad canopies protected the soil from California's autumn sun. He crouched beside one cluster, lifted a cap, examined the stem, then another. Finally he stood. "These are beautiful." Margaret simply smiled. "They're ready?" Daniel asked if he could harvest a few pounds for inspection. By lunchtime, he had filled nearly 3 wooden crates. Every sample passed. Every mushroom met restaurant-grade quality. Before leaving, he made an offer, $8.75 per pound. Margaret didn't react. Daniel assumed she hadn't heard him. "I said $8.75. "I heard you. You aren't surprised?" "I don't grow crops hoping they'll be cheap." Daniel laughed, not mockingly, respectfully. By the end of the afternoon, they shook hands on the first shipment. The orchard had earned its first customer. Let me tell you about mushrooms and walnut trees. Many people believed walnut orchards could produce only one profitable crop because the trees release natural compounds that make life difficult for certain plants. But carefully selected mushroom species don't compete the same way vegetables do. They feed primarily on decomposing organic material, hardwood chips, fallen branches, and natural forest debris. The walnut canopy provides shade that helps retain moisture, while irrigation for the trees also benefits the mushroom beds when carefully managed. Margaret wasn't fighting nature. She was letting 2 different systems work together. Sometimes the smartest farming isn't adding something new. It's noticing what nature has quietly been doing all along. News of the Sacramento buyer spread even faster than the original rumors. This time people weren't laughing. They were curious. Pickup trucks slowed outside Margaret's property. Neighbors found excuses to drive past. Some even parked along the county road just to stare through the fence. Rick Dalton refused to believe the stories. "There has to be a catch," he told Harold Benson. "There always is." Harold wasn't so sure anymore. 3 days later, he drove to Margaret's orchard alone. She was loading wooden harvest crates onto a flatbed trailer behind the farmel. "You've been busy," Harold said. "A little. Mind if I look around?" "Not at all." For nearly an hour, Harold walked the orchard without speaking. He noticed moisture sensors, carefully stacked mulch, handwritten markers identifying different growing areas, detailed notebooks hanging inside waterproof containers near irrigation valves. Nothing looked accidental. Everything looked measured. "You planned all this for years." Margaret nodded. "I started learning before I started planting." Harold took a deep breath. "I owe you an apology." She looked at him. "For what?" "I should have listened instead of assuming." Margaret shrugged gently. "Most people hear something new before they ever see it." Harold smiled. "And now I've seen it." Just then, another pickup entered the lane. Then another. Then a third. The orchard was no longer attracting curious neighbors. It was attracting growers. Men who had laughed only weeks earlier were now carrying notebooks of their own. But Rick Dalton wasn't among them. He was preparing something that would force the entire county to choose who they believed. And before sunset, he made a phone call that would bring state agricultural inspectors to Margaret's farm. Rick Dalton had built his reputation on numbers. At 38, He managed nearly 600 acres of walnuts with modern irrigation controls, high-capacity harvesters, and financing that allowed him to replace equipment every few years. He believed efficiency solved almost every farming problem. What Margaret had done didn't fit his calculations. It bothered him, not because he hated her, because he couldn't explain her success. So on October 20th, 1987, he contacted the Sutter County Agricultural Commissioner's office and requested an inspection. He insisted someone should verify that mushrooms grown beneath walnut trees were safe to sell and that the orchard met state agricultural standards. The request was legitimate. No one accused Margaret of breaking the law, but everyone understood why it had been made. If inspectors found a serious problem, the harvest would stop immediately. By Friday morning, 2 county vehicles rolled through the orchard gate. Agricultural Inspector Linda Chavez stepped out with soil specialist Robert Klein. Both carried clipboards, sampling equipment, and more curiosity than suspicion. Margaret greeted them with fresh coffee before showing them the orchard. She answered every question, opened every record book, explained every irrigation schedule. Nothing was hidden. For nearly 4 hours, they collected soil samples, measured moisture levels, inspected mushroom beds, examined walnut roots, and reviewed harvest records. Rick stood near the lane, watching every movement. He expected someone to shake their head. No one did. Instead, Linda asked Margaret if she could see the notebooks dating back to the first experiments. Margaret returned with 5 weathered binders. Every page contained dates, rainfall, temperatures, harvest weights, photographs, even handwritten notes explaining failed experiments. Linda slowly closed the final binder. I've rarely seen records this complete. Rick's confidence began to fade. Then Robert pointed toward the old 1952 Farm-A-Lam, parked beside the equipment shed. You still use that? Every week, Margaret replied. He walked around the tractor with obvious admiration. The old Farmals were built differently. Margaret rested one hand on the hood. They were built to stay. Robert smiled. They certainly have. Let me tell you about torque and horsepower. People often think horsepower is what makes a tractor powerful. It isn't the whole story. Horsepower measures how quickly work can be done. Torque measures the twisting force that actually gets heavy loads moving. Older tractors like the Farm-A-Lam produce generous low-speed torque through large displacement engines turning relatively slowly. That meant they could pull steadily for hours without constantly revving at high engine speeds. Modern tractors produce far greater horsepower, but those older machines earned their reputation because they delivered smooth, dependable pulling power day after day. For orchard work, where patience mattered more than speed, that steady torque was often exactly what a farmer needed. By late afternoon, the inspectors gathered beside their trucks. Rick folded his arms. So, Linda looked directly at him. We found no violations. He frowned. No concerns. We found excellent records, healthy soil management, and a well-maintained operation. She paused. In fact, this orchard may become an interesting case study. The words hit harder than any argument. Several nearby growers exchanged surprised looks. Harold Benson couldn't hide his smile. Rick stared across the orchard toward Margaret. For the first time since all this had begun, he wasn't looking at an old widow trying something foolish. He was looking at someone who had quietly gotten there first. As the inspectors drove away, another truck appeared at the entrance. Its trailer carried empty, refrigerated containers. Painted across the driver's door were the words, Northern California Specialty Produce. The driver climbed out carrying a purchase contract, and the number written on the final page was larger than Margaret had earned from walnuts alone in the previous harvest season. Margaret read the contract twice before signing it, not because she doubted the offer, because Samuel had always taught her that every agreement deserved a second reading, no matter how honest a person standing across the table appeared to be. The representative from Northern California Specialty Produce, Michael Reeves, extended his hand. We'd like to purchase your entire mushroom harvest for the season. Margaret nodded. If the quality stays the same, you'll have it. Michael smiled. It already has. The agreement guaranteed a minimum purchase of 18,000 pounds of specialty mushrooms over the coming harvest period. at the contracted price. The orchard would generate more income from the shaded ground beneath the walnut trees than many neighboring farms earned from their primary crop. Word spread through Sutter County before sunset. This time, nobody laughed. They calculated. Coffee shops filled with conversations about mushroom production. Feed stores ran out of hardwood mulch. The county extension office received more phone calls in 1 week than it normally handled in a month. Everyone wanted answers. Only Margaret seemed uninterested in the attention. The next morning, she climbed onto the old 1952 Farmel M, checked the oil, let the engine warm for several minutes, and drove slowly between the walnut rows exactly as she had done for years. Success hadn't changed her routine. It had only confirmed it. Have you ever known you were right when everyone around you insisted you were wrong? Not because you were smarter, not because you were lucky, but because you kept paying attention after everyone else stopped looking. Most people give up the moment they become the only one who believes. Margaret never asked how many people agreed with her. She only asked whether the land agreed. Let me tell you about Samuel Collins. He was never famous, never wealthy, never interviewed by newspapers. But he had one habit that shaped Margaret's entire life. Whenever someone declared, "That's how we've always done it," Samuel would quietly walk into the field and ask a different question. Does the ground agree? If the answer was no, he changed. If the answer was yes, he stayed the course. Margaret had inherited more than his orchard. She had inherited his way of thinking. The county simply hadn't noticed until now. One chilly morning in early November 1987, Rick Dalton drove into the orchard alone. There was no audience, no laughter, no confidence hiding behind a crowd. Margaret was sorting fresh mushrooms into wooden harvest boxes. Rick removed his cap. "I owe you something." Margaret looked up. "You don't owe me mushrooms." He smiled awkwardly. "I owe you an apology." She waited. I laughed. "You did. I thought you'd lost your mind." "I know. I was wrong." Margaret brushed a little soil from one of the mushroom caps before placing it gently into a crate. "We've all been wrong about something." Rick looked around the orchard. "I'd like to learn." Those 4 words meant more to Margaret than any compliment. "Then come tomorrow morning. I will bring work gloves." Rick laughed. This time, only because he understood. For the next several weeks, people witnessed something they never expected. The younger farmer who had mocked Margaret at the Grange Hall now worked beside her before sunrise. She taught him how to judge moisture by the feel of the mulch instead of relying only on instruments, how to harvest mushrooms without damaging the next flush, how to notice tiny changes in the walnut leaves that hinted at irrigation problems days before they became visible across the orchard. She never reminded him about the laughter. She never needed to. Rick remembered every word on his own. By late November, refrigerated trucks arrived almost daily. Restaurants in San Francisco, Sacramento, and Napa Valley began requesting additional shipments. Chefs praised the mushrooms for their consistent quality. Agricultural writers started calling. One regional newspaper published a headline that surprised the entire county. "Widowed walnut grower finds second harvest beneath the trees." Visitors came from neighboring counties. Some expected a miracle. Instead, they found careful planning, patience, detailed records, and an elderly woman who still believed the soil deserved more credit than the farmer. Yet the busiest week of the season was still ahead, because the annual Harvest Festival was approaching, and the county planned to announce something that would leave Margaret speechless just as she climbed onto the stage. The Sutter County Harvest Festival opened on December 5, 1987, under clear blue skies and cool winter air. For decades, the event had celebrated the region's rice, peaches, prunes, and walnuts. Families wandered through equipment displays, livestock barns, homemade pie contests, and rows of restored vintage tractors polished until they reflected the afternoon sun. Margaret almost didn't attend. She disliked crowds. Harold Benson finally convinced her. "They're asking you to receive an award," he said. "I've never needed one." "I know, but the county does." She arrived wearing the same faded work shirt she wore in the orchard, refusing to buy new clothes for a ceremony. The old 1952 Farmel M stood on display nearby after members of the local antique tractor club asked permission to exhibit it. Children climbed onto the steel seat, while older farmers smiled at memories of machines they had once driven across fields of their own. Rick Dalton stood beside the tractor for nearly an hour. Whenever someone asked why the machine mattered, he answered before anyone else could, because it never quit. Then he added something that surprised even himself. Neither did the woman who owns it. That afternoon, hundreds of people gathered before the main stage. Harold stepped to the microphone first. He spoke about farming traditions, about drought, about changing markets, about how agriculture survived only because farmers continued learning. Then he looked toward Margaret. Sometimes, he said, the most important lesson doesn't come from the newest equipment or the biggest operation. Sometimes it comes from the quietest person in the county. He invited Margaret onto the stage. The applause began politely, then grew louder. Then everyone stood. Rick was among the first to clap. He didn't stop until Margaret reached the microphone. She looked across the crowd for several long seconds. "I don't know much about speeches," she said softly. The audience laughed gently. "But I know this." She held up one of her worn notebooks. "The land has been teaching us for thousands of years." She paused. "The problem isn't that nature stopped speaking. It's that we stopped listening." Silence settled over the fairgrounds. Not uncomfortable silence. Respectful silence. The kind earned over decades. As Margaret stepped away from the microphone, Rick met her at the bottom of the stage. "I'll remember that," he said. She smiled. "So will I." Neither of them noticed a reporter taking photographs nearby. By the following week, Margaret's story had reached newspapers across California. Letters began arriving from farmers in Oregon, Washington, and even Missouri asking how she had managed to make two crops thrive together. She answered every letter, by hand, every single one. And before winter ended, the state university contacted her with an invitation that would carry her quiet idea far beyond Sutter County and change the future of her orchard forever. In January 1988, a letter arrived from the University of California Cooperative Extension. The researchers had followed newspaper coverage of Margaret Collins' orchard and wanted to visit her farm. They were not coming to challenge her methods. They wanted to understand them. Margaret laughed quietly when she finished reading the letter. "For 40 years, she whispered to herself, "I've been learning from this ground. Now the professors want the ground to teach them too." A month later, a small group of horticulturists, soil scientists, and agricultural advisors walked through the Walnut orchard carrying notebooks much like Margaret's own. Instead of giving a lecture, she simply led them from tree to tree, explaining what she had observed over the years. She showed them how moisture stayed more consistent beneath the walnut canopy. She explained why she spread fresh hardwood chips every season instead of all at once. She pointed toward the old 1952 Farmel M, parked exactly where Samuel had always left it. "That tractor has carried every load of mulch you've seen today," she said. One researcher asked how many hours were on the engine. Margaret smiled. "I stopped counting years ago." The visitors spent nearly 2 days collecting data. When they finally departed, one professor turned back before climbing into the university truck. "Mrs. Collins," he said, "we came here expecting to study mushrooms. And we're leaving after learning about observation." 5 years passed. By 1993, several growers across Northern California had begun experimenting with carefully managed mushroom production beneath mature walnut orchards. Not every farm succeeded. Margaret always reminded people that copying an idea was easier than understanding it. "The mushrooms aren't the secret," she often said. "The attention is." Rick Dalton became one of those who succeeded. He never tried to duplicate Margaret's orchard exactly. Instead, he spent months studying his own land before planting a single mushroom bed. Whenever reporters asked who inspired him, he gave the same answer: "The woman I laughed at." He never hid that part of the story. He believed people needed to hear it. Let me tell you about legacy. Most people think a farmer leaves behind acres, tractors, or bank accounts. Those things matter, but they rarely last forever. The greatest inheritance is a way of seeing the land, a habit of noticing small changes before they become large problems, of respecting seasons instead of fighting them, and of believing that patience often earns rewards no shortcut can match. Margaret never patented an idea. She never built a corporation. She simply proved that careful observation could become one of the most valuable tools on any farm. In the spring of 1998, at the age of 83, Margaret officially handed daily responsibility for the orchard to her daughter, Helen Collins Parker, who had quietly worked beside her for years. The farm remained exactly where it had always been. Every winter it received fresh oil. Every spring it hauled mulch. Every autumn it carried another harvest beneath the walnut trees. Visitors often asked why Helen never replaced it. She answered exactly as her mother would have. It still does a job. Margaret passed away peacefully in October 2001, surrounded by family after spending one final afternoon looking across the orchard she and Samuel had built together. At her memorial, Rick Dalton stood before neighbors, friends, and fellow growers. "I once laughed because I thought she was behind the times," he said. "The truth was, she was years ahead of the rest of us." No one disagreed. The applause that followed sounded very different from the laughter heard years earlier. It carried gratitude. It carried humility. And it carried respect. Some things don't become valuable because the world finally notices them. They become valuable because someone cared for them long enough for the world to understand why they mattered. If someone in your life ever believed in an idea that everyone else dismissed, I'd love to hear about them in the comments. Sometimes the quietest stories become the ones we remember the longest. And if you'd like to hear about the Iowa farmer who saved forgotten steam engine from a scrapyard and unknowingly rescued an entire town's harvest decades later, that story is waiting. I hope you'll be here for it.